Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy McCain, and I'm an artist. I'm the founder of something called the Ocean Currency Network, which you can see at ocn.ai. It's a bunch of robots and really cool gadgets to quantify the true value of marine protected areas so we can make more and show the value of doing so. But I'm also the co-founder of something called the Ultramarine Ocean Action Summit that happens on Sir Richard Branson's Necker Island. But I want to introduce you to something cool called the Break It Down Show. So here is the Break It Down Show. And you know what? I'm really super excited the fact that now there's 1,000 episodes. 1,000 episodes. That's a lot of hard work. Pete Turner is an awesome dude, and I'm always grateful every time he invites me onto his show. You know, we've got a wonderful guest that I want to introduce you to, William Bonk. Now, he wrote an incredible book about environmental poisoning. And Terrane Patrick Long joined as a co-host. But the book is called Exposure, Surviving Historical Ft McClellan. It's a paperback. You can get it on Amazon. Really super cool stuff. I just really feel like, you know, when you focus on these kinds of things, we're using podcasts, we're trying to stay connected to people, that's where real action happens. And so you are connected to an amazing show, and I'm super grateful to be part of it. The work that I'm doing at the Ocean Currency Network is, you know, it's all about how do we work together? How do we bring technology together and try to do really cool stuff? And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you're interested in robots and blockchain and machine learning, then I urge you to go to ocn.ai. Check out what we're doing. Maybe there's something that, like, you know what to do better than me. Let's find a way to work together. That's also kind of what led myself into kind of just working with Susie Mai to create Ultramarine. We meet every year on Sir Richard Branson's Island to talk about the biggest threats facing the oceans and what we can actually do about them. You know, a lot of us feel like maybe we're helpless. Well, we might be helpless by ourselves, but together, not so helpless. We can do a lot of things. The thing I used to always explain to my friends is that, you know, if we knew that the ozone layer was a problem when we were all kids, and we said, hey, there's something we can all do together to fix it, and we did, and we fixed it, I think we can do something for the oceans. So, I'm really grateful. Pete's a wonderful guy, and I love him. What else can I say? The guy's super cool. He's always doing his thing, and he's better at it than I am. So, love you, Pete. Thanks for having me on the show.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Bill Bonk, and you're watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, this is cool. I like to have shows, Bill, where we address hard topics and things where, like, you know, we focus on all these problems. And it turns out there's a whole lot of problems out there that we don't deal with, aren't aware of, or only get micro fractions of our attention. And you've written a fantastic book. Let me pull the link up here. But basically, you've written a book about your time, your investigation into chemical pollution and how it's harming service members. It's called Exposure, Surviving Historical McClellan. And as I talked to Chris Schaefer's a friend of mine. He runs Tactical 16. You're published by them. And we were talking about your story. And I'm like, I need this story on the show, man, because it's as a criminal investigator, this is one of the things you did professionally in the Army. And now you've got a book talking, like, kind of using the same skills, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, there's this commonality amongst all these chemicals, right? Whether it's burn pits, 9/11, Agent Orange. But the sad part is the human factor. It's the lack of due diligence. It's the deception. It's the denials that really it's our peers, right? It's our friends. It's our neighbors. It's people that work in the government that administer this stuff and really screw over, you know, military personnel and civilians. And it repeats itself over and over.
Is this an ongoing, okay, God, it's a terrible question. Why is this problem continuing? I mean, we have to burn things in burn pits. I understand why, because logistically you're in the middle of Afghanistan and you're I lived in a mine. like an open pit mine in Bosnia, and we had to burn our stuff, which means everything goes in there. But why can't we wrap our head around the lessons from these chemicals? I mean, look at all the 9/11 New York firefighters that have died from cancer in the last 20 years. It's bonkers. We know better. Why does this continue?
Well, go back further, right? Go back to Agent Orange, like what a debacle that is. And I write about Agent Orange in the book, and I think it'll freak a lot of people out because, first of all, everything I write about, I took from government documents, right? It's not opinionated. It's not hearsay, if you will, right? I mean, I took most of it out of government documents, and they talk about trainers eating Agent Orange back in the day, back in the 60s when they were training military personnel, eating it, right? Like, I'd love to find those people now and see how they're doing. They talk about they didn't really spray directly with Agent Orange because they weren't spraying places where we had offensive troops, basically, right? It was all preparation stuff. They had fighter escorts. So they say, well, there would have been a lot more casualties from friendly fire if people were killed when they were spraying Agent Orange and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And then you go to things like Fort McClellan is just lost in the shuffle. I mean, you had 700,000 people go through training at Fort McClellan, and they're lost in the wind. You had the whole Women's Army Corps, MP's Chemical Corps, the Defense Polygraph Institute, and that's lost, right? You don't see anything about that. We hear about K2, we hear about burn pits, but it's endless. And you mentioned 9/11. When a law enforcement officer or first responder dies in the line of duty, their family gets a payout through the Department of Justice of like $365,000, right? When somebody that dies because of that's a VA service-connected disability because of a burn pit or Agent Orange, their family gets a $1,500 benefit or a $2,000 benefit depending on when.
I was going to say that $360,000 is not enough. I mean, you've made a person an entry-level employee for 10 years. Like that's what you've replaced. Like that should be like automatic chemical, exposure, death, automatic retirement, for whoever the spouse is or this, like it's got to be way more expensive. It's got to, like that's, and then you say $1,500.
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me?
I mean, it's this all boils down to money, right? I mean, it's all money and policy decisions. And again, it's people that are doing it. It's our friends and neighbors. It's our peers, people in the government making decisions that are good, bad, or indifferent, right? Some are good, some are bad, and some crush us. But, for all those, it's heartbreaking when you read about all these veterans that are exposed to this stuff and have all these really unique illnesses and cancers, and there's no family history. I mean, that stuff just didn't magically appear.
And you certainly can't discount it. If you get cancer, and you say, hey, I was exposed to open pits or I was exposed to something. How about the desert Gulf syndrome where these guys are like, I don't know, I'm just exhausted. My joints hurt. We're like, you're probably faking.
Right.
You don't get the benefit of the doubt at some point. By the way, we've got Terrane Long here, and he's joined us. And Terrence works on a similar part of this problem. And the reason why I wanted to have Terry and Bill on together is Terry looks at, in particular, and he can correct me, Terry, for sure, and I want you to talk about it a little bit. Terry looks at the international problem we have of our munitions just simply being dumped or left and forgotten. Like, I think one of the things you said is like anything before 1971 that's in the ocean doesn't exist, even though it's really there. And we can see, get this, Bill, Terry was saying that there are fish around these, heavy metals, all of the stuff that's rotting out, and they're basically genetically designed now to have cancer. They're born with the shit. And it's crazy. So Terry, thanks for jumping in. I appreciate you making the effort. We were just talking about why do we continue to have to struggle with this? I mean, we're talking about burn pits and just we continue to expose our service members, our first responders to chemicals in general, all of us to chemicals by acting the way we do. Why?
Bill? Which one of you?
Well, you could weigh in, Terry.
Okay. My opinion is everything is driven by business and driven by money. When you start to look at the chemicals that we're faced with, they all originated somewhere, some chemical company. If you look at the munitions that we got to deal with, that had to originate from somewhere. So these groups, they have big paid lobbyists who go around to government and they lobby government to allow them to, make a high profit, increase 401ks and different types of stuff like this, which I believe at the expense of the environment. And I've been involved in this a number of times with things like the Chemical Weapons Convention or at a United Nations summit, where at the end of the day, when you walk away, you don't really feel like you've done something. All you feel like is you compromise the goal you set out to do. And usually the goal is, based on human health, environment, getting rid of landmines, getting rid of munitions, or, some nasty like this. So the private sector, they have all this money. They have the voice of the politicians and the government people. It's just the way it actually works. Like in Canada, for an example, our current government is continually getting caught with concerns with their hands in the kitty and, hundreds of billions of dollars, and I do mean hundreds of billions of dollars going out with no control or oversight. Recently, we had an NGO where a prime minister and his wife Speaks Act get $900 million without any kind of a contract or anything at all like that, simply because they were all friends. And sorry for taking so long, but I've seen so much it bothers me. Like, it takes me back to when I was working on landmines, and I had a gentleman call me up and he asked to meet with me, and he said, I want to change my name in the community from a shrewd businessman to a humanitarian, and I want to get some publicity out of this. So I started doing stuff with him and with landmines, and like within a couple of months, the next thing I know, we got the Order of Canada for his outstanding commitments for landmines. A few days later, I didn't have a charity. His whole family incorporated it. And then the same government that's in power now was giving him $33 million, or I should say gave him $33 million. And, a year later, the money's gone, the charity's gone, everybody's gone. So unfortunately, money and business really drives a lot of, are we going to clean up the environment or not? It's easy to get money to clean up for munitions if we're doing it for an economic reason, for a windmill, for a pipeline. But if we want to clean it up to save the coral because it's bleaching or killing it, that's not on the table, even though that's what we preach at all these international conventions.
So in the book, I write about similar stuff, Terry, and Fort McClellan was right next to the town of Anniston, Alabama, and just 8 or 9 miles away is Anniston Army Depot, which is a heavy equipment refurbishment site, right? So they use a lot of solvent, a lot of TCE. They polluted the water. But in the city of Anniston, you had Monsanto's primary PCB making factory since like 1929. So you had PCBs dumping into the air, water, and all the site media. You had, Anniston Army Depot polluting the water. And then you had the U.S. Army's chemical school at Fort McClellan, losing radioactive isotopes, polluting the water and site media with heavy metals, solvents, herbicides, all these contaminants, right? So in 2011, there was an article in the Anniston Star where they estimated the cleanup cost. So Fort McClellan shut down in 1999 as a part of the base realignment actions, right? So in 2011, this article in the Anniston Star quotes a price tag of $3.2 billion was spent cleaning stuff up, right? And mostly Anniston, which was never actually categorized as a EPA Superfund, NPL site. It was considered under the alternative approach, whatever that is. A part of Anniston Army Depot was a part of the Southeast Industrial Area was made a Superfund site. Fort McClellan was never made any kind of Superfund site, although they were treated like a Superfund site. So, $3.2 billion, and that's not all inclusive. And then the VA says there's no adverse health conditions associated with service at Fort McClellan, right? So then you would ask yourself, well, what the hell was $3.2 billion spent on cleaning up, right? I mean, and then like Terry said, it's all about the money. You see, in these, I reference probably 4, 5, 6 instances in the book where, I mean, they openly said that this is the predecessor to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Army basically said, due to time and money and effort, we're going to leave these certain buildings contaminated with radioactive material, with ionizing radiation, which were then later used by the MP school to conduct training for years.
Hold on. Did you just say nuclear contaminated buildings that were closed to save money to not have to mitigate them were then reopened? I mean, how does that even happen?
And the thing is, Pete, it's all in the government's documents. I mean, they say, well, in the ventilation system, well, we sealed it off, but, blah. And then they use it for the MP museum and the MP training classroom.
Oh,
and the same thing on the maneuver fields. They had this field, ride out field. And back in the 60s, they basically 1 mile by 2 miles, they buried radioactive isotopes in the ground so they could simulate nuclear fallout. And they use like fishing rods to raise and lower these radioactive isotopes, right? So when they shut all that down, they forgot some of it. I don't know how. I don't know how you really just lose control of radioactive material. But it took like 30 or 40 years to decontaminate it. And it was well after Fort McClellan closed in 1999. They're still finding radioactive isotopes, ionizing radiation. And the same thing with all the other contaminants, like the TCE. Like I do these comparisons in the book, and this is all taken out of these government reports or newspaper articles from the Anniston Star, where they say something like 27 million pounds of TCE are in the groundwater. But somehow it's not a concern to the citizens of Anniston or the people on Fort McClellan. Like 27 million pounds.
Let me just jump in here and say something, and I may get in a little bit of trouble for this, but what you're saying resonates with me because I was working on a deployment, and that's how I'll get around to the classification part. I was working on a deployment, and we discovered, the Americans did, that there was a vast aquifer that was unknown in this region. And that was classified for some stupid fucking reason. But we weren't even allowed to talk about fresh water, right? So you're telling me that if you've got contaminated water, someone is going to be honest about that? I just don't trust. Terry, what are your thoughts when you hear these kind of things?
Well, if you go to the city of Duluth, all their fresh water intake comes directly over conventional munitions, and conventional munitions have some of the most deadliest toxins in the food chain coming from chemical or munition constituents such as TNTs. I believe everything I've just heard. For an example, I went off a site in Newfoundland, and it was a U.S. dump site, and it was supposed to be radiological, chemical, and ammunitions all mixed in one. So I went to the U.S. to College Park, spent some time going through the National Archives there in D.C., and I was able to identify actually nuclear weapons in the site. So I went to the site. I was able to secure a core sample, went to the core sample, and I found elevated levels of nuclear isotopes well above naturally occurring. And, when I try to address stuff like that, people just shut me down and, okay, that was a nice job you had with oil and gas, but you're not getting the next one. And it's really like that. It's all about being part of the team and getting the job done and, doing what needs to be done on the end of the day. It's really sad to say that. It really is, because we preach human health. We preach the environment. We do the talk, but not the walk. And that's what we got to start doing. We got to start calling out our politicians that, hey, these sound bites, they're not doing anything for the fish. They're not doing anything for climate change. They're not doing anything for my sick children or my sick cousin or my elders who are having problems with underlying health issues because all these contaminants have found their way into the food web, because we continue to feel that we're defeated. And I'll give you an example. There's hundreds of millions of tons of munitions in the ocean. And when I talk to somebody, the first thing they do, they feel defeated. I can't deal with that. I can't address that. That's too many. We'll never clean it up. But somebody like me, that's my area of expertise, I can see the solutions. I can see how to clean it up. I can see how we can all come together to save the ocean. But there's not enough Terrys and there's not enough Williams to go around to get our voices heard or to be injected into the debate so, we can have that constructive engagement too. What they're doing is they're finding ways to disengage with us. So, our stories don't get out. We have to go on social media and try to get it out. Try taking this to a newspaper and get a story. You might get a story, but it's gone the next day.
I mean, it's just, I wish I could say it was shocking, but it's all too normal. By the way, all three of us are veterans, right? And we all see these problems from our own, unique perspectives and everything. And I like to gather their perspectives, but I'm so critical of what we do as a military force, and the cost associated with deploying people, we're not paying nearly enough. I mean, if you go and you deploy, you should be clocking like an override on retirement. You don't have to serve 20 years, because there's plenty of people that are like, I've had enough. I've served 15 years and getting out. That's not a normal career. That's like 3 careers in one if you've deployed nonstop. And then all this chemical stuff, it's exasperating. And is this a problem? I know you're reporting on it, Bill, and you're using actual government documents to put all this together, but do you have hope that there's enough people out there that will tip this thing over so we can start to deal with this in a real way, even if it's expensive? Because we've already spent the money. We're just cashing it in cancer,
I think I tried to approach this kind of idealistically, I think. There's a lot of Facebook groups. There's a lot of social media groups about Fort McClellan. There's a lot of infighting. There's some people I'll call social media detractors, right? There's groups of veterans that say, if you have all these illnesses you have are because of your lifestyle. You're a fat fucking slob. You drink, you smoke, blah. That's why you have colon cancer. That's why you have, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or something like that, right? But the second part, like I really wanted to make a credible, comprehensive source of information about Fort McClellan, right? And just I use no exculpatory information. I just kind of take everything and throw it at the wall, kind of all this stuff that's not good. And it's horrible. Like you continuously see these arsenic naturally occurring. Well, when you see arsenic like 17 times, and arsenic is in all these herbicides and lewisite and mustard gas and all this crap, and then you see the EPA say, there's this one report where the EPA praises a contractor for eliminating an arsenic threat at this one location. And the EPA is giving kudos to the contractor and saying they saved the Army a public relations nightmare. And I'm like, seriously? Like, when is the EPA, when are they worried about the Army's public relations nightmare, by like their job's to protect the environment or something, and you see these reports, like the EPA and the Army and the contractor, they lost 35 ranges at Fort McClellan. They couldn't find them. An M60 range or a Law rocket range or something, right? Lost 35 ranges.
Wait,
the contractors,
you have to give that makes no damn sense. So let's understand exactly what you're saying, because I think the three of us all know what you're saying is the military would train in a piece of land. Maybe they shot machine guns. Maybe they shot tank killing rockets. Maybe they shot a variety of things. And then at some point they let that range go and it was overgrown by natural brush and whatever. And so now they literally don't know where this contaminant, because you're talking lead, all these different propellants, all these things. Mm-hmm. And they 60 of these, and this is
35.
lots of
35 ranges.
And then how big is a range, would you say? I mean, we're talking hectares sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking 4 acres, 10 acres, 15 acres, right? So then the contractor sends the report to the EPA. The EPA says, thank you for the report. We have no way to verify this, but we'll approve it anyway and move on, right? And I'm like, who puts that in a memo? Like, who would actually write that? Like, we have, thanks for the information, but we have no way to verify. We don't have enough time, and we can't verify that your information is accurate, but we're going to move on. It's mind-boggling. I mean, I don't know. But back to your original point, Pete, I think, so there's a lot of these stovepipe groups, but I do see like Fort McClellan's lost, right? I mean, so many people went through Fort McClellan, and the weird thing is the VA has its own dedicated webpage to the Army's Fort McClellan. It's the only Army fort that has its own webpage to basically say, hey, you might have been exposed to all this shit, but there's nothing that affects your health. If you think about like Camp Lejeune, if you're familiar, their water was tainted, and the rulings there, like if you spent 30 days cumulative over like 30 years, if you did a cumulative 30 days at Camp Lejeune, you're eligible for medical care and benefits, right? So Fort McClellan, the average person went there for 16 weeks of training, right? If you were an MP, you did 1 station unit training, basic and AIT. So, and the same things like TCE, vinyl chloride, benzene, and perc that tainted Camp Lejeune's water are all tainting Fort McClellan's water. But, nothing, crickets. But I do see there's a lot more effort around exposure in general, not just burn pits or K2. I don't think there's a real holistic approach to it, but it does seem like there's a little bit of hope that, maybe exposure in general will take a better look. And so the second part of what I was doing was sending books to members of Congress, right? Like, I don't know. I just felt like if somebody would read the book, I wrote the book so they could make their own judgment, basically be the judge and jury on if adverse health may have resulted from the exposure, right? There's no doubt people were exposed, but were they actually harmed? So I have this thing where I'm sending books to members of Congress through generous, friends and family are basically supporting books. And I've sent out 100 so far, which is pretty good, right? Because that's almost a fifth of Congress. But I think that might be, urinating into the wind. I'm not sure at this point.
Terry, what are your thoughts on all this?
I've heard so much. I have so many thoughts. I had to actually try to write them down while you're going along. I want to say at Fort McClellan and a lot of these other BRAC bases, a lot of it is military constituents that are found in the soils and the water. And when you talk about lost ranges, I found lost ranges in the middle of cities where the more I dug, all I done was dug up munitions. I found buildings and water pipes built on top of munitions where you could see them all just laying there, and somebody went, oh, munitions, we'll just build it on top of it. It's amazing what I've seen. All these sites have been lost all around the world. Even the offshore sites have been lost. Somebody will know about a site in a particular city, and over time, everybody will just forget about it. And then a child will lose his hand from a grenade or something like that. And when they do the historical research, they'll find out that was a range. But when they did the transfer of the range, they didn't do a range clearance. So, in a lot of areas, it's just back to the money. How do we get rid of it? How do we close it off as quickly as we can and get on with the next issue? Now, I'm not trying to defend the military, but in the defense of the military, how do they decide that this amount of money is going to go towards cleanup, and this amount of money is going to go towards a tank, and this amount of money is going to go so on throughout the military system? So what we really need to do is we need to look like what we did with landmines, and we set up a national forum where we could actually look and discuss all the different issues so we could come together, create synergies, and engage with people and learn from one another. And then what we did is we set up regional action centers for the landmines. So in one country, we had an action center. In another country, we had an action center, and everybody coordinated with the international center. So what they did is they had teams to go and clean up landmines. So now we have countries around the world that are landmine free. Why couldn't we have teams, actual teams, based on the contaminants as the size of the team? And they have one in New York, and they're looking at all these problems in New York, and they have another satellite team in Chicago, and money is being funneled directly into that. So the military doesn't have to determine, well, is this really military money or is this cleanup money? And, if you look at the Canadian military, environment is not one of the top 10 priorities within the budget framework. So how can they turn around and do something about this? I can honestly say the Canadian military has spent tens of millions of dollars to try to silence me, to try to discredit me, rather than to try to clean up the munition. In one case, following a Senate hearing where there was 3 recommendations unanimously by all senators, none of them were followed. And the first recommendation was to take it away from the military because it was the fox guarding the hen house. And what did they do? They gave it to the military, and they set up a UXO DND legacy site program. Now the program is there. One person. One person. And we have more than 1,000 sites off of Eastern Canada. We have more than 940 sites across the country impacted by munitions. And this is what happens. Government hopes it all falls silent. And if you look at the chemicals, you can't have a president come in, for an example. And I don't know if he has jurisdiction, or let's say a governor or something like that, to say, okay, let's clean up them chemicals, and I want them cleaned up now. Well, the reality is it won't be cleaned up in his 4-year term or her 4-year term. So a lot of them don't look at that because they can't get a win out of that, because people see that as a failure because they started something and they didn't complete what they started. Rather than turning around saying, this is an opportunity to create employment, to put people back to work, to have the resources right in our community to respond to the incidents as they take place. That's what these United Nations sustainable goals are supposed to be about. Sustaining the ocean so we can live from the resources, and removing poverty. All these other goals are all there, but it's a lot of talk at the United Nations and not a lot of action, a lot of the walk.
Terry, you've been doing this for a while. What congressional members in the U.S. or Canada, or parliament members in Canada, which ones are actually leaning on this problem in a serious way? I mean, surely somebody has said, this is important to me, I'm going to work on it.
Well, I don't have, I shouldn't say that. I have some board members, and one of our board members from the United States, from the University of Georgia, and I think he should come on the show and give you a presentation to talk about these chemicals and the impact on human health, is Professor James Porter, and he won the 2018 Peabody Award for his movie Chasing Coral. Now, James has actually gone into the munition sites in Puerto Rico. He found the TNT in the water column, where you could see no munitions, 100,000 times the EPA level. He found the heavy metals in the lakes and the lobsters in the munition sites, 365 times the EPA level. Now, if I could just elaborate a bit on that, we did about a year before President Trump got elected, we had an expert panel established at the Center for Disease Control at Atlanta, Georgia, where we were going to look at the human health and environment, the impact from these munitions. Now, the reason we established, or the CDC wanted to establish this group with us, is because they were recovering chemical weapons in the fishing nets, taking them into the plants in Delaware, and these chemicals were actually getting into the food and getting into the food chain. So what they would do is they would take the chemical weapons in the fish and dump it back out to the ocean or garbage or wherever they got rid of it. But the reality is that the trawlers went back out in the same places fishing again, taking back into contaminated fish. So at the Center for Disease Control, I was the chair of it, and I was extremely disappointed in the CDC. The CDC gave us 2 terms of reference and wouldn't define which terms of reference we were following. One term of reference had us inspecting these facilities to make sure everything, off gases and stuff like this, were happening the way they were supposed to be happening, right down to developing the human health and science on the conventional and the chemical weapons. It came, and now on the panel as well was a member of the Pentagon. Now, it was clear to me the Pentagon was funding any actions that the CDC was doing. So, it's only natural if you're an organization doing something and somebody's giving you the money to do it, you kind of listen to what they tell you to do. Now, I'm not saying anything was done wrong, but what I'm saying is we started off and we had an excellent panel. We had people like Professor Porter and other world experts on this panel, and it was disbanded. And we were very disappointed, and shortly after that, President Trump was elected. Now, we're not saying it's related to that, but what we're saying is that panel never did the work it was supposed to do to come to the conclusions to see if U.S. citizens were being harmed by these underwater weapons. And that's the sad part, is the U.S. citizens never had the opportunity to get the answers. Now, when you have Senate hearings in the U.S., I'm disappointed that I don't get invited. Now, the reason I'm disappointed is because industry gets invited. Now, you have, in the United States, you have an ordnance remediation group of different companies that all get together trying to lobby your government to clean up munitions, whether they be on land or underwater munitions. Now, some of those companies get big contracts from the Pentagon, and some of them don't. They're the wannabe companies, or I shouldn't say wannabe. They want to be part of the process and, eventually get larger contracts. So when they go into the Senate, the last thing they want to do is upset the Pentagon or upset the Department of Defense, because they're not going to get that next contract. It really is that simple. They will not get the next contract. And I can tell you that because I've been a director of a U.S. company. I've been the vice president of a U.S. company for munitions response. I've been a program manager. I've been a field supervisor. I've filled all the different positions you could think of, and I speak from experience with more than 40 years in the industry.
Bill? This stuff is just, it's like a 2x4 to the face,
Well, so Fort McClellan's kind of a case study in that, big picture, I guess. 2002, Barbara Mikulski did a Senate hearing in Anniston about the PCB situation. And one of the things that struck me from that hearing was, she mentions that the regional director for the EPA in Atlanta had to recuse themselves. And the deputy assistant to the administrator had to recuse themselves. And you know why? Because they were former Monsanto executives, now having high-paying EPA positions. So, at Fort McClellan, they had the money. They spent the money on the munitions cleanup, but they constantly talk about the VA and the Pentagon. Say, well, it'll cost a lot of money to identify Fort McClellan veterans, and I'm like, how can that be? We filled out all those forms in triplicates back in the 70s and 80s and stuff, right? And everything's in electrons now, right? I mean, you have the Social Security Master Death Index. People pay taxes. People go to the VA. How can you not be able to identify Fort McClellan veterans, right? And then just to be able to do something, maybe it's not a health registry, but doing nothing does absolutely nothing, right? And you see this pushback. There was another Senate hearing in 2008 where the VA pushed back, and they're basing decisions on 20-year-old documents that were inaccurate to begin with. And I kind of shred those documents in the book, right? I mean, I kind of really go into them, and it's really sad to see, the VA and their citations, when people are appealing and they go back and they quote these Fort McClellan documents that are just patently false and inaccurate. It's disturbing. And nobody, there's no voice to that. That's the sad part.
I can say this for a fact. My DD-214 is a shit show. Like they got so much stuff wrong. So in the military's defense, they're a shit show when it comes to like personnel records. But you're right. I mean, you can absolutely build a system where you find all these people. You know, I mean, I get ads all the time for 3M's crappy hearing, protection things.
Or through veterans organizations, right? Because we all have orders stuffed in some dresser somewhere that has all of our names and social security numbers for your whole platoon, company, whoever you did a movement with. I mean, the information's out there. So to say like, it's too, I think in 2015, there was an article in the Washington Times that this Pentagon official, they intercepted some, I don't want to say intercepted, but an email was obtained between the Pentagon and a Senate committee that said, it would be too expensive to the Army when they're downsizing right now and stuff. And I'm like, that's total bullshit. You spent like $5 billion on uniform changes over a 5-year period, but you can't spend, I don't know, a few million or something, or, do some ads and, try to do something. I saw Chris's note here earlier. I just think like I left Fort McClellan, I went to Germany, right? I had 5 officers in my company, 5 lieutenants, right? And now one of them is dead. One of them's had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The other has medical issues. One's perfectly fine, and the other I haven't been in contact with, right? But you see this, guys that I served with that went through Fort McClellan, died in their 50s from ocular melanoma or, just these rare diseases, liver cancer. Liver cancer is not real common. But, then you go back and look at how much TCE, how much solvent was in the water, even though, and there's no real testing and stuff. And now we're sort of on a wing and a prayer because, it's 20 years later, right after Fort McClellan closed. But what's interesting is I found some documents when I was wrapping up the book, like a 2019 document from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management and the management company that's developing Fort McClellan. And there's like 45 areas that are like hands off on Fort McClellan, don't dig, don't do this, no use whatsoever. And you're like, well, what the hell? Like if this was not an issue, prior to 1999, how come this is still an issue today? Like, how come we're still spending money and there's all these controls and things going on? And, it's bizarre because if you look in the book and, they talk about, chemical weapons material. Like there's an interesting mention from an EPA official who basically says, breakdown products from chemical munitions are basically just chemicals. So why would you treat them any different in the environment, unless they're causing an issue or something, right? Like I would sit there and go, wow, that's a breakdown product of sarin gas or HD mustard. That should be bad. But their interpretation, and Terry could probably relate to this better, is, it's just a chemical. And if it's not really a harmful chemical, it doesn't need any more addressing or something, and that's probably my perspective, I guess.
Well, let me ask Terry, because Terry needs to say the same things. Like, what is the human or just ecological cost? I mean, I hate to even have this disregarded because it's like, oh, it's the environment, but like this shit is really like it's important.
I kind of don't like you asking me that question respectively, and the reason being is, Bill William spoke a minute ago about, they cleaned up the munitions and stuff like that. And he mentioned burn pits. Well, for I don't know how many years, they've been burning hundreds of thousands of tons near cities every year of these munitions. They've been putting them in trays of oil and lighting them on fire. They've been taking the munition in the field on the ground, putting additional toxic explosives on top of them, blowing them up, spreading the toxins across the soil or across the seafloor. In the seafloor, they get into the sea life and find their way back into the food. On the soil, they find their way into the water columns and stuff like that. And when you blow them up, a lot of the toxins actually drift in the air, fall in rivers, make their way back out to the ocean. So if you look at the cycle of war or warfare materials, that's what we're doing. We have a big cycle happening around the globe right now. And the first thing, we tried to do at the Academy of Sciences is say that open burning, open detonation, shouldn't be done. So I'm not sure what the final decision was on that from the U.S. Academy of Scientists, but nobody in the United States should be taking more toxic explosives, putting them on top of a munition and blowing them up. The technology is there at the University of Georgia. There's a doctor there, Valentine, and he actually has an agent that he can inject into the munitions and neutralize all the munition inside and make it environmentally friendly, so there has no energetic and no risk toxicology properties that you can deal with this. It was a year, maybe 2 years ago, I wrote the legal aspects, looking at all the treaties through the London-Paris Convention and a risk assessment for the European Union. And I was really shocked that you couldn't find a risk assessment detailing all the different chemical weapons, all the different conventional weapons, their booster explosives, their fuses, and what's in the propellants, triple and single based, and things like that. And I was just entirely shocked. But I did have the opportunity, and it took a number of months and a number of people helping me. But we were able to detail that, both the energetic and the toxicology threat from all of them. And again, I was surprised that the military, they don't have that. I don't want to speak for the U.S. military, but if you ask the Canadian military, this UN UXO DND legacy site that I talked about, their official version is the munitions can't pollute anything. They just can't. It's impossible. So, all around the world, with the exception of Canada and the United States, countries are finding these chemicals in the water, the soil, and so on. And we're finding them in the same scenarios that you would find in the U.S. And I'll give you an example. One of the chemical weapons sites we investigated in the Baltic Sea, the chemical plume was 13 kilometers long. So, that plume was 13 kilometers long, and then all of a sudden it breaks off and it drips off somewhere else. And then the next plume comes up, and the next plume, and the next plume. So we got chemical weapon sites in every sea of the ocean, hundreds of millions of tons. So when does that stop? I hope we can get James, Professor Porter, on. I know he will come on and speak with you, but there's really something important here in science in a 100-year cycle. And you really need to hear this. It's like I said before, if you take the fish and they spawn on the munition bed, like they do between Denmark and Germany, after a couple of years, the fish genetically gets cancer because they genetically have it now. And if you remove the munitions, the fish will still get cancer. So this is a very serious thing that, we're changing sea life all around the world. And politicians are the ones that are stopping us. They're telling us they're environmentalists. They're telling us they're great guys, and women. But the first thing they do is compromise.
When you stuff, I absolutely want to do an entire series on this. Like let's you and I and Bill too, let's get together, line out 5 episodes, and really just hammer this. Because if no one else will, I will. Because if we want to leave a better planet for our kids, we should stop getting everybody and everything cancer. We should. I was Terry. I was walking by a munitions range, and not like anything special, just like this is where they were blowing things up. And, they don't announce this stuff in combat zones usually. And so, boom, this huge bomb goes off and it just waylays my right ear. I'm walking in a normal area. I'm not an unsafe area at all. And now I never even realized, I probably had toxins pour down on me from that explosion. I mean, it blasted my ear bad enough. My ear doesn't work very good. And I never even considered the cancer, it's crazy. I just can't believe these things.
And what's interesting is, again, Fort McClellan being just a small portion, but when Terry's talking about these plumes, there's these massive plumes in varying places under Fort McClellan and under the city of Anniston and under Anniston Army Depot, of chloroform, of TCE, mostly solvent plumes. The funny thing is, it's not really funny, but you look at the PCBs that were manufactured a couple miles from Fort McClellan, and the main water intake for the city of Anniston and Fort McClellan and the Anniston Army Depot was, say, like 6 miles downstream from Monsanto. Now they report PCBs being 60 miles downstream. They report PCBs being in tree bark, 5 miles away from Monsanto, which would put that inside the perimeter of Fort McClellan. Yet the Army maintains there's no PCB hazard from Monsanto on Fort McClellan. Yet PCBs are found in Eskimo breast milk and in the Arctic and Antarctic and stuff, right? But it can't go magically, 4 or 5 miles to Fort McClellan. And the sad thing is the government puts out these reports that other government agencies rely on and make decisions in the VBA and stuff. But if you examine the data, like I found 10 instances of PCB detection on Fort McClellan before the government made this 2006 report about there being no PCB risk on Fort McClellan. So you're like, what about these 10 instances, right? Same thing with chemical weapons material. And magically, none of that was discovered before Fort McClellan closed. It was all after. Yet still there's no issues with the VA and, adverse health effects on veterans. It really becomes mind-boggling. And when you start looking at, again, the complacency, the lack of due diligence, the deception, the denials, it's really disturbing. And it's not just Fort McClellan, right? It's all these places. Veterans are exposed to like in Uzbekistan, K2, the burn pits. I look at myself. I wasn't in the military that long. I mean, I went to Fort McClellan. I went to Germany, did my first enlistment, came out. I was in the reserves and guard, got activated for Desert Storm, right? Went to Saudi and Iraq. And then I go, well, that just kind of sucks because I was in this contaminated environment at Fort McClellan. I go to Germany. I'm at a nuke site for 18 months, is a PFC sitting on a crate with a Pershing 2 missile flying in a Chinook, right? The chopper pilots are like, if the bird goes down, we'll be to 100 yards upwind. And I'm like, if the bird goes down, we're going to be the Ronco Slice-O-Matic in this Chinook, sitting on this nuke. And then, go
Ronco, not a sponsor, just saying everything else.
But, then go to Saudi and Iraq and get, the investigational anthrax vaccine and be exposed to sarin gas plumes and all this other shit. Then you're like, it's really kind of hard to pin down. Then you throw your maturity in there, right? Aging, and people have medical problems, right? So it's hard when you have, suddenly you have, your gallbladder removed, thyroid cancer, skin cancer. These things don't run in your family. It's pretty hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, it is a hard pill to swallow, and it's an expensive pill to swallow. I mean, all of this stuff costs money and attention, and apparently, I don't have the numbers, obviously, but I would gather that we kill ourselves with this stuff at the military much more than we die in combat. I mean, if you take out suicides and accidents, the military's a pretty safe place considering the risk of the job. Except for you're going to get cancer. I mean, the VA is filled with people that are super sick like that. It's terrifying when you go to the VA for care like I do. I'm like, oh my God, look at all these folks that are just wrecked. And there's a lot of cancer there.
Yeah, but I think the worst part of that, Pete, is like the rejection, right? You file a claim and it's like rejected by, with no real basis either. You don't really have any idea. They're just like, I mean, I filed a claim and it's like rejected, and it's like it's not in your military medical records. I'm like, go in e-benefits and look at this file. Here it is. Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. So like, and then the fact that you got to be your own advocate is just kind of bizarre.
It's exasperating.
I've not used a VSO or attorneys or anything. I wanted to do it by myself to see what the process would be like.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, everybody I met in the VA, even the contractors at C&P exams and stuff, were all pretty decent. But the filing process,
it's ridiculous.
Oh my God! I mean, you know, you get these rejections, these denials, and it's literally like a fifth grader wrote the response back to you or something.
Yeah, or they didn't even look. I'm like, no, I said my hips. So like, yeah, we looked at your back, and I'm like, no, I said my hips. Anyhow,
I mean,
I don't want to get distracted by the VA because it will also distract me. But I do want to get back into this thing because Terry, I met Terry through Jeremy McCain, who also works on ocean preservation and conservation, and he gave me the example, and I thought this was really helpful. It's like this stuff doesn't go away, right? You guys are talking about plumes and particulate getting all the way up, to where Eskimos are, and all of this stuff. It does move around. It's a closed system, the stuff. Unless you remediate it and put it somewhere or make it, I guess I'll say inert. Terry knows the better word than I do. That stuff is still out there and it will continue to be, moving around at whatever pace that it does. It's not going to stop just because we say, and then isn't the burden of proof on the government to and by the way, there's a laundry list of complaints here. What if you were with the military, not in it? So how about how the contractors that are on Fort McClellan or fill in the blank place or fill in the blank camp, and there's an open burn
civilians.
Pit. How about all of the USAID workers, the State Department, I was with the Department of Defense a lot of times. All of these folks don't have a VA system, and they're like, I don't know why I got skin cancer. I just, have it or whatever it is, right? It's a real. You can see how this problem just stacks on top of itself so quickly. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's parts in the book where I mention it, and I mean, Terry would know this, and you've already talked about it, but they'll say like to get that TCE plumes out of the water under Anniston Army Depot will take 600 years or 1,000 years. And you're like, well, how can this be good for anybody? How can this be good for the citizens of Anniston? How can it be good for the National Guard that's still using Fort McClellan and still using some of these training areas? But nobody has a problem with that,
But the reason it takes 600 years is like anything. We started looking at landmines. We were 50 years where we were planting landmines. Not me, sorry. I was in the military, but I never laid landmines. We were 50 years laying landmines. But there was no technology development on cleaning them up. So when they implemented the landmine treaty, all of a sudden, all these new technologies came to fruition. It's the same thing with cleaning up the different chemicals. When we look at the different plumes, sure, it'll take 600 years, but have we taken the time to develop and sit down and do a technology or a science demonstration to try to come up with better solutions? If we use the current solutions, well, it's obviously they're not the solution. So why not invest in new and emerging solutions? And really, any problem can be solved. It's at what cost? And if the cost is too high, like munitions, where if we need to use the detonation chamber, it costs $8 or $9 million to put that munition in to treat the off gases. But now we got a proprietary technology that we can inject in the munitions for, maybe $100, maybe $200. And the more we do, the cheaper we can do it. So what we do by, facing the problem is we develop solutions and we streamline those solutions and processes so we actually get better at it and we can deal with it. Humans got to quit running away because they think it's too bad and too big to attack. They should look at that as a challenge and look at it as new ways to come up with solutions. Really. Again, we can meet those challenges, but we need the opportunity and we need to sit down and think like it's a challenge and work collectively. People are saying the chemicals can't hurt you. We all know they can. People say they're gone. We all know they're still there. These are people who are just trying to speak over us why we care and they don't.
Yeah. On that note, Terry, and at Fort McClellan, even like as late as 2010, somebody will be out walking their dog through the redeveloped land, and they'll be on a stream, and they'll find a Livens drum from World War I, right? Sitting in the creek bed or something that has phosphine gas in it or something, and you're like, here they've spent all this money cleaning up and they've done all this stuff, but they're still, even when they maybe adequately address the problem, they still have problems, right? And then you see problems with the contractors, like they're just stacking munitions behind this tree. There's some newspaper report that I read, and I really wasn't kind of tracking that aspect of things in the book, but it's just mind-boggling at the end of the day.
And
It
you're saying
really
you're
is.
talking about Anniston in general, but I bet you could go a couple miles up the road to Redstone and find the same exact problem. And I'm just picking Redstone because it's close by. It happens to be a place where a lot of rockets are. I mean, but you know, it's crazy.
I think there are a lot of rockets.
So a couple things real quick, just to pay the bills here.
You know,
Go ahead.
If I could say something a little bit about my background, I'm a Canadian military engineer, and I'm also a chemical weapons and a conventional weapons expert. And I'm trained with Canada in that. And I'm also trained NATO Advanced with the British Army School of Ammunition for these stuff. And I'm a commissioned United Nations officer. And I actually, pardon me for saying this, but I had the pleasure of actually going to some of these facilities and going to the Pentagon and meeting with different people from the U.S. Department of Defense. And they are very nice people. Unfortunately, we have different opinions about what the chemicals can do and can't do. But again, I try to say I'm speaking from a lot of experience and from a lot of experience on our board that people are facing these issues all the time. So you've got to look at the protocols within your country. You got to look at international protocols. So with the underwater munitions, we go to what we call the Chemical Weapons Convention in The Hague, the OPCW. But then they have two caveats there saying the munitions aren't there. They're all gone. They're disappeared. And what that really means is back in 1995, when they signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, they all agreed to hide the munitions because of their own country's liability. So when you try to talk about the munitions and you go, wow, how come they're not answering me and they won't respond to this? Well, we have international protocols that say they're not there. So
that's crazy.
So,
anybody who wants to find out more about what Terry does, you can go to underwatermunitions.org and you can get involved with that. He's also got an earlier episode of the Break It Down show. I highly encourage you guys to listen to that. If you're listening on the podcast side, those links will be in the show notes for sure. And I want to have Terry back as many times as I can, because when he says people like shut them down, like I need him doing this work and I need to elevate his voice. So you will hear more from Terry for sure. And then on the screen, you're also going to see Bill's book, Exposure, Surviving Historic Fort McClellan on Amazon. I've got the Amazon link in there. If you go through the link, that helps us support the show and obviously helps William with his book writing career. These folks get to do this because we support them. So if you're passionate about the environment, here are two people that are lifting up the environmental voice, because it's not just, rainforest. Like these are human things that we can go out and remediate. We have technology, or we can develop and improve the technology that's there. So I encourage you guys. I'm passionate about this, if you guys can't tell. And it just drives me a little bit crazy that we don't take this stuff seriously. And it's not going to get better if we keep doing it, if we keep hiding it, if we keep saying it's not there. Like, we have to, at some point, like Terry said, we have to stop running from these problems, turn around and face them. And if it's too expensive, then quit going to war. Just stop and clean your shit up. Anyhow, that's what I had to say. I'm going to get off my soapbox, and I'm going to let Terry say what he wants to say as we close down, and then Bill, you'll have the floor after that to kind of wrap it up. Terry?
I would say it's very important for people to talk about these munitions, talk to your friends, talk about them in the community, and you may find out that they're closer to you than you think.
Pete, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak out on behalf of any veterans or veterans' families, associates that had anything to do with Fort McClellan and the citizens of Anniston. Terry, very nice to meet you. And, I think collectively, if we all keep hammering away, idealistically, something good is going to happen. So,
well, you got to start with an ideal and go from there. Here's what I'm going to commit to. My representative is Katie Porter. I'm going to write her staff an email today and say, I want to talk to you about this, or at least get Terry and Bill in there to talk about what they're doing, because we need to do a better job. And she professes to be an environmentalist, so here's an opportunity for her to shine. So, fellas,
Great.
let's do more of this. Let's continue this message. Let's continue to talk about this and learn about it, because I think the more we do that, the more opportunity there is for people to discover this story and then hopefully get those ideals converted into actions. Thank you guys both so much for coming on. Let me sign off.
Thank you, Bill. Nice meeting you too.
Thanks, Terry.